My brother stood between me and the entrance of his lavish wedding, smiling like this was all perfectly reasonable. The security team didn't look at me with confusion. They looked at me with specific instructions. Then he said it loud enough for the cameras, the guests, and every neighbor who had watched us grow up. "She works in kitchens for a living. She doesn't belong in the video." The words landed clean and sharp, not angry, not emotional, just final. At that moment, I understood this wasn't about my clothes or the wedding or even simple embarrassment. This was about erasing my past identity, about making sure I stayed exactly where they were comfortable seeing me. The country club stretched behind him like a vision of everything our family never was when we were children. White tents caught the afternoon light. String lights waited for evening. Somewhere inside, a string quartet played something classical and pleasant. The parking lot held more luxury vehicles than our entire street back in Ohio ever saw in a decade. This was not just a wedding. This was a production, and every detail had been curated to project a specific image of success, taste, and arrival. I had driven 4 hours to be here. I wore the nicest dress I owned, navy blue simple clean. I had ironed it twice the night before. My shoes were modest heels, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I came as a sister, not as a statement. But the moment I stepped toward the entrance, I felt the shift. The security guard didn't smile. He didn't greet me the way he greeted the couple ahead of me. He stepped forward, blocking my path with practiced neutrality, and asked for my name. When I gave it, he glanced at his clipboard, then at me, then back at the clipboard. He didn't say I wasn't on the list. He said something worse. He said there was a note next to my name. He said he needed to get someone. That someone was my brother. Marcus appeared in a tailored suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. He walked toward me without hurry, his expression calm, controlled. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had already decided how this moment would unfold long before I arrived. Behind him, I could see the edge of the ceremony space, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, guests mingling with champagne glasses, laughter drifting across the manicured lawn. He stopped a few feet away from me. The security guard stepped aside, giving us space but not privacy. Everyone nearby could hear. That was intentional. My brother had always understood the power of an audience. "You came," he said, as if this were already a problem. "You invited me," I replied. He tilted his head slightly, the way he used to do when we were children, and he was about to explain why I was wrong about something. "I did," he said. "But I didn't think you'd actually show up. And honestly, Natalie, look at yourself. Look at this place. The cameras are running. The video team is capturing everything. Do you really want to be in that footage?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what answer would matter. He continued without waiting. "You work in kitchens, Natalie. That's not a judgment. That's just a fact. And this is my wedding. This is the day I've been building toward for years. Do you understand what it would look like if you're standing in the background of our wedding video? Do you understand what people would say?" I understood exactly what people would say. They would say nothing. They wouldn't even notice me. But Marcus would know I was there, and that was the problem. My presence would remind him of where he started. My existence in that frame would contradict the story he was telling about himself. Behind us, more guests arrived. They walked past without looking at me, guided smoothly through the entrance by staff who smiled and handed them programs. I was standing at the gate of my own brother's wedding, being explained to like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong event. I looked at the security guards. They weren't uncomfortable. They had been briefed. This was part of the plan. I looked at the guests, at the ones who knew me from childhood, the ones who had watched Marcus and me grow up on the same street, play in the same backyard, and sit at the same dinner table. None of them intervened. A few glanced over, then looked away. One woman, a neighbor from our old block, met my eyes for half a second before turning to admire a flower arrangement. My mother wasn't outside. My father wasn't outside. They were already inside, probably seated, probably waiting for the ceremony to begin. They had not come out to greet me. They had not sent a message. They had not done anything at all. Marcus lowered his voice slightly, leaning in, as if offering me a kindness. "Look," he said, "I'm not saying you can't be here. I'm saying you shouldn't be visible. There's a difference. You can watch from the back, you can stay out of the frame, just don't make this about you." "This was never about me," I said quietly. He straightened up, satisfied. "Good. Then we understand each other." He turned and walked back toward the ceremony space without another word. The security guard shifted slightly, not blocking my path but not inviting me forward either. The message was clear. I could enter, but only if I agreed to disappear. I stood there for a long moment. The music drifted out from the tents. Laughter rose and fell. Someone clinked a glass. The world continued as if nothing had happened because for everyone except me, nothing had. I thought about pushing forward, walking in anyway, standing wherever I wanted. I thought about making a scene, raising my voice, forcing them to acknowledge what they were doing. But I knew how that would end. I would become the difficult one. The bitter sister. The one who ruined the day. The story would shift from what Marcus did to what I couldn't handle. So I stepped back. Not because I agreed, not because I believed I didn't belong, but because I saw with painful clarity what this family had become. They didn't need me to be absent to feel complete. They needed me small. They needed my presence to serve as contrast, as proof of their success, as the version of our family that didn't make it. And if I wasn't willing to play that role quietly, they preferred I not play any role at all. I walked back to my car. The gravel crunched under my modest heels. The sun was still warm, the sky still blue, the day still beautiful. Behind me, the wedding continued without pause. No one followed me. No one called my name. The music kept playing and the cameras kept rolling, capturing a story from which I had been carefully removed. I sat in my car for a few minutes, not crying, not shaking, just still, just thinking. They believed this was the end of the story. They believed I would drive home, resume my invisible life, and fade into the background of their rising narrative. They believed that because they had always believed it, because they had never asked what I was building when no one was watching, because they had never imagined that the sister who works in kitchens might have been preparing for something they couldn't see. I started the engine. The country club shrank in my rearview mirror, and somewhere inside me, a quiet certainty took root. They had just told the world who they thought I was. They had no idea they were wrong. The highway stretched ahead of me, flat and indifferent as I drove away from the country club. The radio played something I didn't hear. My hand stayed steady on the wheel. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was somewhere deeper, somewhere older. The humiliation at the wedding wasn't a surprise. It was a summary. It was everything that had always been true, finally spoken out loud. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody moved very far. Our house was modest, a 2-story with a chain-link fence and a backyard that flooded every spring. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. My parents worked hard, my father at a manufacturing plant, my mother at a medical billing office. They were decent people who believed in doing the right thing, paying your bills on time, and not drawing unnecessary attention. Marcus was born 3 years before me. By the time I arrived, the template had already been set. He was the firstborn, the son, the one with potential. I was the second child, the daughter, the one who would figure it out. That distinction might seem small, but it shaped everything. From the beginning, Marcus was introduced first. At family gatherings, at church, at school events, my parents would lead with him his achievements, his plans, his personality. I would be mentioned after, if at all. This is Marcus, and this is his sister. Not Natalie, his sister. As if my identity existed only in relation to his. Teachers expected him to succeed because they had heard about him. Neighbors asked about his grades, his sports, his future. When they spoke to me, the questions were softer, less invested. How are you doing? Are you keeping up? As if my trajectory was already lower, already less worth tracking. I don't think my parents meant to create this divide. They loved us both in their way. But love and attention are not the same thing. Marcus received both in abundance. I received love in theory and attention in scraps. When Marcus brought home good grades, the house celebrated. When I brought home good grades, the house acknowledged. He got praise, I got approval. He got future talk, I got present tense nods. The difference was subtle enough that I couldn't name it as a child, but I felt it every single day. My mother was the one who shaped the household rhythm. She decided what mattered, what got discussed, what got remembered, and what mattered was Marcus. His college applications were a family project. His job interviews were discussed at dinner. His promotions were announced to relatives like dispatches from the front lines of success. My milestones existed in quieter registers. A job I got became a sentence mentioned once. A challenge I overcame became something I handled on my own. She wasn't cruel. She was simply certain. Certain that Marcus was destined for something, and certain that I was not. She never said this directly, but she didn't need to. Every choice she made communicated it. Every conversation she steered, every opportunity she prioritized, every resource she allocated told the same story. He was the investment. I was the remainder. My father was different, but not better. He didn't favor Marcus overtly. He simply didn't push back against the current. When my mother organized the family around Marcus's needs, my father nodded along. When Marcus received more support, more encouragement, more space, my father watched from the sidelines without comment. His silence was not neutral. It was permission. I used to think that if I worked harder, the attention would shift. If I earned better grades, won some award, achieved something undeniable, they would finally see me as equal. So I tried. I studied longer, pushed myself further, took on responsibilities no one asked me to take. And I succeeded quietly, consistently. But the response never changed. My achievements were acknowledged and then forgotten. Marcus's achievements were celebrated and then repeated. By high school, I had stopped expecting anything different. I didn't resent Marcus directly. He was just living the life that had been arranged for him. He believed in his own exceptionalism because everyone around him reinforced it. He didn't see himself as favored. He saw himself as simply better. And why wouldn't he? That's what he had been told since birth. What I resented, if I'm honest, was the system. The quiet machinery of preference that operated in our household, in our extended family, in our community. The way everyone agreed without discussion that some people mattered more than others. The way I was expected to accept my position without complaint. The favoritism extended beyond our immediate family. Aunts and uncles asked Marcus about his career and asked me about my health. Grandparents remembered his birthday with checks and remembered mine with cards. Cousins looked up to him and looked past me. The whole network operated on the same assumption that Marcus was ascending and I was staying still. I learned to stop waiting for recognition. I learned to build my own systems of measurement, my own standards, my own sense of progress. I couldn't control how they saw me, but I could control how I saw myself. That realization came slowly, painfully, but once it arrived, it changed everything. By the time I left for college, I had already separated internally from the family structure. I went to a state school, paid my own way through part-time jobs, and graduated without ceremony. No one flew out for my graduation. No one asked about my degree. I didn't expect them to. The pattern was too established to break. Marcus, meanwhile, went to a better school on loans my parents co-signed. He graduated with fanfare, moved to a bigger city, climbed a ladder that had been greased for his ascent. His success was treated as inevitable. His struggles were treated as temporary setbacks. His mistakes were explained away. His wins were magnified. I watched from a distance, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I understood now what I hadn't understood as a child. This family didn't lack love. It lacked fairness. And fairness wasn't something I could earn from them. It was something I would have to build for myself somewhere else with people who didn't already have a script for who I was supposed to be. The highway signs passed by, marking miles between the wedding and wherever I was going next. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt awake, fully awake to a truth I had always known but never fully accepted. I didn't grow up in a family that didn't love me. I grew up in a family that only knew how to love in a certain order, and I had been last in that order for as long as I could remember. That wasn't going to change. But I was. The label didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, one assumption at a time, until it became the shorthand everyone used when they talked about me. Not Natalie, not the one with the degree, not the one who moved to Chicago. Just the one who works in kitchens, as if that single phrase captured everything worth knowing about a person. The first time I heard it used as a descriptor was at a family reunion 3 years after I moved away. I had come back for a weekend, mostly out of obligation, partly out of some lingering hope that things might be different. I was standing near the buffet table when I overheard my aunt explaining to me about a cousin's new wife. That's Natalie Marcus's sister. She works at a restaurant in the kitchen, I think. The tone wasn't malicious, it was dismissive, which was worse. Malice would have required seeing me as a threat. Dismissal just meant I didn't register at all. I didn't correct her. What would I have said? That I had a degree, that I was working multiple jobs to pay off debt while building skills no one in this family understood, that the restaurant job was one of several, not the definition of my life. None of that would have mattered. She had already decided who I was. The label fit her expectations, and expectations are almost impossible to dislodge once they're set. From that point forward, the phrase traveled through the family like a shared joke no one found funny but everyone repeated. At holidays, at phone calls, at the rare gatherings I still attended. Oh, Natalie, she's still working in kitchens. The words were always delivered with the same tone, a mix of pity and confirmation, as if my circumstances validated something they had always suspected, as if I had finally become the person they had always assumed I would be. My mother never corrected anyone. When relatives asked about me, she gave short answers and changed the subject. When they asked about Marcus, she expanded, elaborated, glowed. The contrast was consistent and devastating. Not because I needed her praise, but because her silence communicated agreement. She didn't defend me because she believed the label was accurate. My father continued his pattern of passive observation. He heard the comments, he watched the condescension, and he said nothing. I used to wonder if his silence was cowardice or conviction. Eventually, I realized it didn't matter. The effect was the same. His non-intervention was its own form of participation. Marcus, meanwhile, used the label with casual frequency. In conversations I wasn't part of, in introductions I didn't witness, he positioned me as the counterpoint to his success. He never said it with cruelty. He said it with the comfort of someone who believed it was simply true. His sister works in kitchens. The statement served his narrative perfectly. He rose. I didn't. The contrast made his achievements seem even more impressive by comparison. I could have fought back. I could have announced my other jobs, my side projects, the skills I was quietly developing in the hours after my shifts ended. But I had learned something important by then. Defending yourself to people who have already decided you are small only makes you look smaller. They don't hear explanations. They hear excuses. They don't see ambition. They see desperation. The only way to change their perception was to become so undeniably different that their old labels no longer fit. And that required time, patience, and strategic invisibility. So I let them believe it. I let the label stick. I stopped attending most family events not out of shame, but out of efficiency. Every hour spent defending myself was an hour not spent building myself. Every conversation about my job was a conversation that drained energy I couldn't afford to waste. I withdrew not because they pushed me out, but because staying meant accepting a role that wasn't true. The restaurant job itself wasn't shameful. I worked hard there. I showed up on time, handled pressure, learned how commercial kitchens operated from the ground up. The work taught me discipline, timing, and the ability to function under stress without complaint. These weren't small skills. They were foundational. But nobody in my family saw that. They saw a title kitchen staff and stopped looking further. What they didn't know, what I never told them, was that the restaurant was just one piece of a larger strategy. During the day, I worked there. During the evenings, I took online courses. During the weekends, I studied market analysis, financial modeling, and business strategy. I read books my family had never heard of, took notes they never saw, and built knowledge they couldn't imagine me possessing. The kitchen job gave me stability and anonymity. It allowed me to exist below their radar while I constructed something they would never expect. I used to wonder why I didn't just tell them. Why keep it secret? Why not prove them wrong immediately? The answer became clearer over time. I didn't want their approval. I wanted something more durable, I wanted to reach a position where their opinions simply didn't matter, where the gap between their perception and my reality was so wide that closing it was their problem, not mine. Telling them early would have invited skepticism, mockery, or worse, unsolicited advice. Staying silent allowed me to build without interference. The label also served as a filter. Anyone who dismissed me based on the kitchen staff revealed something about themselves. They showed me that their respect was conditional on status, not character. They showed me that their interest in me depended on what I could offer their own self-image. The people who still reached out, who still asked real questions, who still saw me as a full person, those were the ones worth keeping. The rest sorted themselves out naturally. By the time Marcus announced his engagement, the label had become so embedded that even his fiancée used it. I heard her once at a dinner I reluctantly attended, referring to me as the one who works in food service. She said it to a friend, not to my face, but sound carries. She wasn't being mean. She was being accurate based on what she had been told. And what she had been told was a story designed to minimize me. I left that dinner early. Not in protest, but in recognition. This family had built a narrative, and I was the character who stayed small so others could look big. Changing that narrative from inside the system was impossible. The only option was to become something outside of it, something so far beyond their framework that the old story collapsed under its own irrelevance. They called me the one who works in kitchens. They had no idea what I was becoming in the hours they didn't see and the silence they assumed was surrender. The transition happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it. One moment I was the overlooked sibling standing at the edge of family conversations, acknowledged but not included. The next moment I was no longer standing at the edge at all. I had been moved outside the circle entirely, and nobody bothered to announce it. It started with decisions being made without me. Small things at first: where to hold Thanksgiving, when to schedule a family visit, whether to take a group vacation. These conversations happened in group texts. I wasn't added to phone calls that didn't include me, discussions I only learned about after the conclusions had been reached. When I asked, I received polite explanations. "We didn't think you'd be interested. You're so busy. It didn't seem like your thing." The excuses were consistent enough to feel rehearsed. They weren't lies exactly. They were convenient assumptions designed to justify what had already been decided. The family had moved on, and I was no longer part of the planning. The exclusion extended to information itself. Important events were mentioned to me late, if at all. A cousin's graduation that I would have attended if someone had told me. An uncle's surgery that I learned about after he had recovered. A family gathering that I found out about through someone's accidentally public social media post. Each time the response was the same apologetic shrug. "We assumed someone told you. We thought you knew." Nobody tracked who was responsible for including me because nobody felt responsible. Marcus became the unofficial center of family coordination. He was the one who made the calls, sent the updates, and decided who needed to know what. And since he had already categorized me as peripheral, I remained peripheral in every logistics chain he controlled. This wasn't malicious planning on his part. It was simply the natural result of his worldview. I didn't matter enough to prioritize, so I wasn't prioritized. My mother went along with whatever Marcus organized. If he didn't include me, she didn't question it. If he said something wasn't relevant to me, she accepted that assessment. Her role had shifted over the years from active favoritism to passive endorsement. She no longer had to make choices that excluded me. She just had to accept choices someone else made. My father remained where he had always been, on the sidelines, observing without intervening. I stopped expecting anything different from him. His silence had long since transformed from disappointment to predictable fact. He would not speak up for me. He would not push back against patterns that harmed me. He would watch, nod along, and continue his quiet life without disruption. The exclusion affected more than logistics. It affected how I was spoken about. In conversations I wasn't part of, I became abstract, a category rather than a person. Marcus's sister, the one who works in food service, the one who stayed behind. My actual life, my daily struggles and small victories, my plans and progress, none of that entered the family narrative. They spoke about a version of me that had been frozen years ago, and they had no interest in updating it. I noticed the shift most clearly at larger gatherings. When I did attend, usually after receiving a last-minute invitation or showing up uninvited to events I heard about secondhand, the dynamic was obvious. Conversations paused when I approached. Topics changed. People smiled politely and said how nice it was to see me, but nobody made room. I was acknowledged like a guest, not a member, someone who had stopped by, not someone who belonged. The wedding exclusion at the country club wasn't an exception. It was the culmination of years of smaller exclusions, each one training everyone involved to see me as separate. By the time Marcus stood at that gate and told security I didn't belong in the video, he was simply articulating what the family had practiced for years. The words were new. The sentiment was old. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty. Cruelty would have required intention, focus, energy directed at harm. This was something more mundane and therefore more painful. This was indifference. I wasn't excluded because they actively wanted to hurt me. I was excluded because including me required effort they didn't want to spend. I was a line item that didn't fit the budget, a variable that complicated the equation, an inconvenience. I spent years wondering if I was being paranoid. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe families naturally drift apart. Maybe the exclusion was mutual, my withdrawal interpreted as disinterest, their distance interpreted as respect for my space. I tried telling myself these stories because the alternative was harder to accept, but the wedding made the alternative undeniable. Standing at that gate, hearing my brother explain why I didn't deserve to be in the frame watching security guards enforce a boundary that had been planned in advance, I understood with perfect clarity. This wasn't a drift. This was architecture. The family had been designed to function without me, and I had finally seen the blueprints. I didn't fight back that day. Fighting back would have required believing that something could change, that speaking up would shift the structure, that the system could be reformed from within. I no longer believed that. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to. It served the people it was built to serve. And I was not one of them. Driving away from the country club, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not yet. Not sadness, not exactly. What I felt was released. For years, I had carried the weight of hoping for inclusion, adjusting myself to stay connected, accepting scraps of belonging, and telling myself they were enough. That weight was heavy, and I hadn't realized how heavy until I set it down. The exclusion was complete now. The family had made their position clear publicly, permanently. There was nothing left to interpret, no ambiguity to navigate. They didn't want me to be visible. They didn't consider me part of the picture they were constructing for the world. And once I accepted that fully, I was free to construct something else entirely. Nobody in my family knew about the apartment in Chicago. They didn't know about the second job, the night classes, or the spreadsheets I built on weekends, tracking my progress toward goals they couldn't imagine. They didn't ask because they weren't curious, and I didn't tell them because curiosity wasn't what I needed from them. I moved to Chicago 6 months after college with $1,200 in savings and a list of skills that didn't translate easily into job postings. The first apartment was barely livable, a studio with radiator heat that clanged at night, and a bathroom so small I had to step into the shower to close the door. I took the kitchen staff job because it was available, because it paid cash on reliable intervals, and because it left my mornings free for other things. Those other things became the center of my life. While the family assumed I was treading water, I was systematically teaching myself the mechanics of financial analysis. I started with free resources, online courses from universities that posted their materials publicly, YouTube videos from industry professionals who explained concepts in plain English library books on accounting and valuation that I renewed so often the librarians knew my name. The learning was slow at first. I didn't have a business background. I didn't have mentors. I didn't have anyone to ask when something didn't make sense. So I read the same chapters multiple times. I paused the videos and rewound. I made mistakes on practice problems and then figured out why. The process was inefficient, but it was mine. After the first year, I added a part-time job at a small accounting firm answering phones and filing paperwork. The pay was minimal, but the access was valuable. I listened to conversations between analysts. I read documents that passed through my hands. I asked questions that my supervisors were too busy to answer completely, then researched the gaps on my own. Nobody saw me as a candidate for anything substantial. They saw me as the quiet girl who kept the files organized. That invisibility was useful. The kitchen job continued because I needed stability. The restaurant operated on rhythms I could predict. I clocked in, did my work, clocked out. The income covered rent and groceries, while the accounting job built something less tangible, but more important, fluency in a language my family didn't speak. I started tracking my progress in a notebook. Weekly assessments, monthly goals, skills acquired, gaps remaining. The notebook wasn't for anyone else to see. It was evidence that I was moving even when the movement was invisible to everyone around me. There were failures. A certification exam I took too early and failed. A freelance project I accepted without understanding the scope and had to abandon. A networking event I attended where I spoke to no one because I didn't know how to start conversations with people who already belonged to the world I was trying to enter. Each failure taught me something specific. Each one narrowed the gap between who I was and who I needed to become. My family called sometimes. The calls were short, functional, and rare. They asked if I was okay, and I said yes. They asked if work was going well, and I said fine. They didn't ask what kind of work. They didn't ask about my goals. They didn't ask about the courses or the certifications or the slow, deliberate construction of a different future. They assumed the answer was the same as always. She's working in kitchens. She's getting by. I let them assume. Explaining would have required defending, and defending would have required caring about their approval. I had stopped caring about their approval years ago. What mattered now was capability, not perception. What mattered was building something real, not convincing people who had already written me off. The third year in Chicago was when things began to shift. The accounting firm gave me a small project reconciling records for a client they didn't have time to service properly. I completed it faster and cleaner than they expected. They gave me another, then another. The projects grew in complexity. My paychecks grew in size. The kitchen shifts decreased as the financial work increased. I didn't announce any of this. There was no moment of triumph to share. No one to share it with. The transition happened quietly, one competency at a time, one project at a time, one step at a time. I wasn't chasing validation. I was building infrastructure. By the time Marcus's wedding invitation arrived, I had been working full-time in financial analysis for almost a year. The kitchen job was behind me, though I never told my family that. The label they had assigned still served its purpose. It kept expectations low. It kept questions minimal. It kept me invisible in exactly the way I needed to be while I continued to grow. I think about those years sometimes. The cold apartments, the exhaustion after double shifts, the loneliness of learning alone. None of it was glamorous. None of it fit the narrative of sudden success that people prefer. It was just work sustained over time, compounding slowly like interest on an account nobody was monitoring. My family didn't ask about any of it. They didn't want to know. Their story required me to stay in place, and asking questions might have disrupted that story. So they protected their narrative by protecting their ignorance. I didn't resent them for it anymore. Resentment required engagement, and I had disengaged. I had built something they couldn't see, using hours they thought were wasted with skills they didn't know I possessed. The gap between who they thought I was and who I had become was growing wider every month. Eventually, that gap would become undeniable. But not yet. Not until the right moment. Not until the reveal would matter in a way that silence couldn't. I learned early that explaining yourself to people who have already decided you're small only gives them more reasons to feel correct. They don't hear your explanations as evidence. They hear them as defensiveness. So I stopped explaining. I stopped defending. I stopped participating in conversations designed to keep me in a category I had already outgrown. The silence was strategic, not passive. Every time I chose not to respond to a dismissive comment, I was choosing to invest that energy elsewhere. Every time I let a family member's condescension pass without challenge, I was choosing to protect my focus rather than scatter it on battles I couldn't win. Silence wasn't surrendered. It was resource allocation. During those years in Chicago, I developed a discipline that had nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with systems. I built routines that didn't depend on motivation. Morning hours for reading and study, work hours at the firm, evening hours for review and planning. The schedule was rigid because I couldn't afford to waste days waiting to feel inspired. Inspiration wasn't the point. Progress was. The people around me at work didn't know about my ambitions. They saw someone who showed up on time, completed tasks accurately, and didn't cause problems. That was enough for them. I didn't need them to see more. Their underestimation was actually an advantage. Nobody interfered with someone they didn't consider a threat. Nobody scrutinized someone they had already dismissed. I used that cover to learn things nobody expected me to learn. Complex financial instruments, risk assessment models, negotiation tactics. I studied the people above me, how they spoke, how they positioned themselves, how they handled pressure. I took notes nobody saw. I ran scenarios nobody reviewed. I prepared for opportunities that didn't exist yet, knowing that when they arrived, preparation would separate me from everyone else who was waiting for the same chance. The training extended beyond technical skills. I worked on how I communicated, how I managed stress, how I processed failure. Each setback became data. Each mistake became a lesson cataloged and applied. I stopped taking rejection personally because personalization was inefficient. What mattered was whether the rejection taught me something useful. If it did, it was valuable. If it didn't, it was just noise. My family continued to exist in their own narrative during this time. Occasional phone calls, holiday messages, updates about Marcus's career that arrived whether I asked for them or not. His promotions, his engagement, his new apartment is in a better part of the city. His trajectory was discussed with enthusiasm. Mine was assumed with indifference. I didn't correct the assumptions. Correcting would have required revealing, and revealing would have disrupted the quiet work I was still doing. The time would come for visibility, but not yet. The foundation needed to be complete first. The skills needed to be undeniable. The position needed to be secure enough that their skepticism couldn't touch it. During this period, something interesting happened. The label of kitchen staff stopped hurting, not because I had grown callous, but because I had grown past it. The phrase described someone I used to be in a job I used to have during a phase of life that had ended. Hearing it now was like hearing someone describe a childhood photograph, accurate in its moment, irrelevant to the present. This psychological shift was important. It meant I could attend family events without feeling diminished. I could listen to their commentary without absorbing it. I could observe their dynamics without needing to change them. I became a visitor to their world rather than a victim of it. That distance gave me perspective I hadn't had before. I watched how they interacted with each other, the power plays, the alliances, the subtle hierarchies. I noticed who got interrupted and who got heard. I tracked who made decisions and who received instructions. The family operated like any other system with its own rules, incentives, and enforcement mechanisms. Understanding those patterns helped me predict their behavior. And predicting their behavior helped me prepare for encounters I knew were coming. The silence also taught me something about other people. Most of them didn't want to know the truth. They wanted to confirm what they already believed. When I offered no information, they filled the gaps with their existing assumptions. Their assumptions were wrong, but wrong assumptions worked in my favor. Let them think I was struggling. Let them think I was stuck. Let them build their sense of superiority on foundations I knew were false. One day those foundations would collapse. One day the gap between their assumptions and my reality would become visible. But I wasn't going to be the one to announce it. Announcements invited debate, and I wasn't interested in debating people whose conclusions were predetermined. I wanted something cleaner. I wanted the truth to arrive in a form they couldn't dismiss from a source they couldn't ignore at a moment when their audience would witness the gap with the same clarity I had been living with for years. That required patience. That required silence. That required years of invisible work compounding into something undeniable. The silence was training for that moment. Every quiet day was practice. Every absorbed slight was preparation. Every assumption I let stand was an investment in the eventual reveal. I wasn't weak. I was waiting. And the difference would become obvious to everyone watching. The woman who changed my trajectory didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic introduction, no recognizable name announced across a crowded room. She appeared at the edge of a crisis nobody else wanted to handle, and she observed how I handled it instead. The firm had taken on a client with complicated holdings, multiple entities spread across jurisdictions with accounting irregularities that suggested either incompetence or worse. The partner assigned to the case had scheduled conflicts. The senior analysts were overloaded with year-end obligations. The project needed someone to organize the initial review, and the senior team assumed the task was beneath consideration for anyone with career ambitions. So they handed it to me. I didn't see it as beneath consideration. I saw it as access. For the first time, I would have direct engagement with source documents, decision-making authority over the approach and visibility into how the firm handled high-stakes complexity. The fact that nobody wanted the assignment only meant nobody would be watching closely. That suited me perfectly. I spent the first 2 weeks building a framework, not just organizing files, but understanding the relationships between entities, the timing of transactions, the patterns that didn't quite fit. I documented anomalies. I created visualizations that mapped the flow of money. I prepared questions that nobody had asked, yet questions designed to surface problems before they became emergencies. The client's representative was a woman in her late 50s who dressed simply and spoke precisely. Her name was Evelyn Crane, and I later learned she managed assets that would have been unimaginable to anyone in my family. But on the day we met, she was just another person across the conference table asking questions that tested whether I understood what I was looking at. I answered her questions directly. I didn't inflate my analysis. I didn't pretend certainty I didn't have. When she asked about potential explanations for specific irregularities, I gave her 3 possibilities ranked by likelihood, along with the additional information that would confirm or eliminate each one. When she asked why the senior analysts weren't in the room, I told her they had other obligations, and that I would relay any concerns that required their attention. She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the materials I had prepared, flipped through the documentation, and examined the visualizations. Then she asked a question I didn't expect. "What would you do next if this were your decision?" I told her. I outlined a sequence of verification steps, resource allocations, and timeline considerations. I explained how I would prioritize the investigation to surface the most significant risks first. I described the documentation standards I would implement to ensure everything was traceable and defensible. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Who trained you?" "Nobody specific," I said. "I trained myself." She nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she had suspected. Then she stood up, thanked me for the presentation, and left without additional comment. I assumed the meeting was unremarkable, that she would report to her principals and never think about me again. 3 days later, she called me directly. Not through the firm, not through my supervisor. A direct line to my desk, which meant she had found my extension through means I didn't understand. She asked if I was available to discuss an opportunity. She didn't explain what kind of opportunity. She just gave me an address and a time. The address was a private office in a building I had walked past many times without ever entering. The interior was quiet, understated, professionally anonymous. She was waiting in a conference room with a single folder on the table. "I've asked about you," she said. "Your firm doesn't think you're notable. Your file shows no advancement. Your supervisors describe you as reliable, but unremarkable." She paused. "Do you agree with that assessment?" I told her my supervisors saw what I showed them. I showed them what was necessary for the role I occupied. If they wanted to see more, they would have to create conditions where more was useful. They hadn't done that. She smiled slightly, the first expression beyond neutral I had seen from her. "Most people in your position complain about lack of opportunity," she said. "You're describing strategic invisibility. I'm describing resource management," I replied. "Attention without promotion is just scrutiny." She opened the folder. Inside was a summary of work she was managing, not for my firm, but for a network of private investors who required someone with specific analytical capabilities. The work was complex, long-term, and compensated at a level that would have made my current salary irrelevant. "I'm not offering you a mentor," she said. "I'm not offering you protection. I'm offering you a test. If you succeed, you'll advance. If you fail, you'll have learned the limits of your capability. Either outcome is valuable. Are you interested?" I was interested. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for time to consider. I didn't need to consult anyone about whether this was the right move. I had been preparing for an opportunity like this for years. I just hadn't known what form it would take. She shook my hand, gave me documentation to review, and told me she expected my analysis within 2 weeks. Then she left, and I sat in that quiet conference room for 10 minutes, processing what had just happened. I hadn't been discovered. I was ready. The preparation preceded the opportunity. The invisible years had built something visible to someone who knew how to look. And now the work would begin at a level my family couldn't imagine. The first meeting with Evelyn's network happened in a room designed to intimidate. Long table, polished to a deep gleam, chairs that cost more than my first car. Windows overlooking the city from a height that made the streets below look like planning diagrams. The people around that table wore their success casually, the way old money always does. They spoke in shorthand I had to decipher on the fly, referencing deals and dynamics I had only read about. I was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years. I was also the only person without a pedigree that anyone recognized. No prestigious university, no family name with generational weight, no sponsor who announced my arrival with superlatives. I was there because Evelyn had vouched for my analysis, and her vouching carried enough weight to secure me a seat. The first weeks were observational. I sat in on meetings where decisions were made about capital allocations that exceeded the lifetime earnings of everyone in my hometown combined. I reviewed portfolios with complexity that would have taken my old firm months to unpack. I asked questions when I didn't understand, not to seem humble, but because pretending to know things I didn't know would have been caught immediately. These people had spent decades reading people. They knew the difference between confidence and bluffing. My first assignment was a stress test for an investment thesis that one of the partners was championing. They wanted someone to find the weaknesses, the scenarios where the thesis would fail, the variables that had been overlooked. This was not a task you gave to someone you trusted. This was a task you gave to someone you were testing. If I missed something significant, it would be discovered later, and my credibility would end before it began. I spent 3 weeks on that analysis. I ran scenarios until my spreadsheets had more tabs than I could track without a naming system. I researched comparable situations from the past 30 years. I identified 6 potential failure points the original thesis had underweighted, and 3 risk correlations nobody had mentioned. When I presented my findings, the room was silent. The partner whose thesis I had dissected looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. "These are valid concerns," he said. "I hadn't considered the regulatory scenario you outlined. I'll need to adjust the timeline. No defensiveness, no dismissal, just acknowledgement of useful work." I understood at that moment that I had entered a different world, one where capability mattered more than credentials, where being right was valued more than being agreeable. The currency here was clarity, and I had spent years accumulating it in secret. The weeks became months. The tests continued, each one harder than the last. I made mistakes. One analysis contained an error that was caught by a junior partner before it reached decision-makers. The correction was swift and public. I apologized, fixed the problem, and documented the process that led to the error so it wouldn't happen again. Nobody coddled me. Nobody pretended the mistake didn't matter. They watched how I recovered, and my recovery told them more than my initial success ever could. Evelyn remained a presence without being a protector. She checked my work, occasionally offered feedback that was precise and unsparingly direct, and never once made excuses for me. When I succeeded, she acknowledged it briefly. When I faced a setback, she analyzed why without judgment. The relationship was purely functional, and I respected that more than any warmth she might have offered instead. During this time, my family continued to exist in their own reality. The occasional message arrived, updates about Marcus's career, his wedding planning, his new apartment. Nobody asked what I was doing. Nobody seemed curious about the life I had built outside their field of vision. When my mother called, she spoke about things that affected her weather neighbors' television shows. The calls ended with vague well wishes that required nothing from either of us. I didn't resent the disconnect anymore. I had grown past it. My life now operated on a different axis entirely. The questions that mattered to me about capital structures and market exposures and risk distributions would have been incomprehensible to anyone in my family. The successes I was accumulating relationships with people who controlled significant resources, seats at tables that required invitation, none of it could be explained in terms they would understand. The wedding invitation arrived during a week when I was working on a time-sensitive analysis. I opened it without surprise. The venue was lavish, the phrasing was formal, and my name appeared on the envelope like an afterthought, which it probably was. Marcus was getting married and the family expected me to attend, because that was what families did. Nobody had asked if I wanted to come. Nobody had inquired about my schedule, my circumstances, or my feelings about the event. I decided to go. Not because I wanted to celebrate Marcus. Not because I felt any connection to the bride whom I had met twice. I decided to go because I was curious. I wanted to see what the family looked like from the position I now occupied. I wanted to understand how they would treat me when they had no idea how far I had traveled from the person they remembered. The drive to the country club would take 4 hours. The dress I chose was simple navy blue professional, without pretension. I didn't call ahead to announce my attendance. I just appeared the way people do when their belongings aren't contingent on permission. What happened at that gate wasn't surprising, it was just confirmation. They still saw me as the one who works in kitchens. They still believed I didn't fit the picture, and they were about to discover in a way that none of them could ignore how catastrophically wrong they had been. The phone call from my mother came on a Wednesday evening while I was reviewing preliminary data for a project that would consume the next several months. Her voice carried the same tone she always used with me, slightly distant, efficient, focused on conveying information rather than connection. "Marcus is getting married next month," she said. "You got the invitation right? I told her I had." "Good," she paused. "The venue is very nice. Everything has been planned beautifully. His fiancée has excellent taste." I said that was nice to hear. The silence that followed suggested she had more to say, but wasn't sure how to say it. Finally, she continued. "We want everything to go smoothly." "You understand, I understand," I said. "Good, because Marcus mentioned there will be photographers, video people, the whole production. It's important that everything looks right." I asked her what she meant by right. Another pause. She wasn't comfortable with directness. She preferred implications that could be denied later. Just, appropriate for the setting. The conversation continued for another minute, but the meaning had already been communicated. They wanted me to attend but not be visible, to be present but not prominent, to fulfill the family obligation without disrupting the image they were constructing for public consumption. I told her I would be there. I didn't promise anything about how I would behave or where I would stand. She seemed satisfied with the ambiguity and ended the call with her usual vague pleasantries. Over the following weeks, more family communications arrived. Not directly to me mostly, but forwarded from group messages that someone occasionally remembered to include me in. The wedding logistics were elaborate, hotel blocks reserved, transportation arranged, seating charts debated. The discussions revealed priorities that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with performance. Who would be photographed with whom? Which guests deserved proximity to the main table? How the video should frame the ceremony? My name appeared once in a message about guest counts. One of my cousins had asked whether I was attending. The response from Marcus was brief. "She'll probably show up. Just keep her out of the main shots." I read that message several times, not because it hurt, because it crystallized something I had suspected for years. I wasn't excluded from consideration out of forgetfulness or negligence. I was excluded deliberately by people who had explicitly discussed how to minimize my presence. The strategy wasn't passive. It was coordinated. This knowledge didn't change my decision to attend. If anything, it made attendance more important. I wanted to see whether they would execute their plan. I wanted to observe the mechanics of the exclusion in real time. And I wanted to be there when circumstances forced them to confront the gap between the person they had reduced me to and the person I had become. The days before the wedding coincided with increased intensity at work. Evelyn had approved my involvement in a transaction that would position me for advancement if executed properly. The timeline was tight, the stakes were significant, and the distraction of family drama was an inefficiency I couldn't afford. I compartmentalized. Wedding logistics occupied a small, contained section of my attention. Work occupied everything else. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully. The navy dress was appropriate, understated, unremarkable. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to compete with the bride. I simply wanted to present myself as what I was, someone who belonged to the family by blood, if not by their preferred narrative. The drive to the country club took 4 hours. I arrived mid-afternoon when guests were still filtering in and the ceremony preparations were reaching their final stages. The venue was exactly as I had expected, from the group messages sprawling immaculate, designed to communicate success to anyone who viewed the photographs. The security presence surprised me slightly. Not that there were guards that made sense for an event of this scale, but they had been given instructions so specific that they could identify me before I identified myself. When I gave my name at the entrance, the guard's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more complicated. He excused himself to make a call. I waited near the entrance, watching other guests pass through without any obstacles. They glanced at me with the casual assessment people give to strangers at weddings, not sure whether I was someone they should recognize. Nobody approached, nobody inquired. When Marcus appeared, his expression confirmed everything the group message had implied. He wasn't surprised to see me. He was prepared to manage me. The conversation that followed his statement about my profession, his concern about the video, his deployment of security as a barrier, was the culmination of a plan that had been developed long before I arrived. Standing at that gate, I felt the two worlds colliding inside me. The world where I was the kitchen staff sister, the family disappointment, the person to be managed and minimized. And the world I had built in the years they hadn't watched, where I was trusted with significant responsibilities by people who commanded resources my family couldn't comprehend. The collision was violent, even if it made no sound. I chose not to fight at that moment. Fighting would have required playing by their rules, creating a scene they could interpret according to their existing framework. The difficult sister, the one who couldn't handle the truth, the problem that needed to be managed. Instead, I stepped back. I let them believe they had won. I returned to my car, sat in silence, and waited. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew the story wasn't over. I knew that events were already in motion that would bring these two worlds together in a way they couldn't control. The wedding would continue, the cameras would roll, the images would be captured. But by the end of the day, everyone who had participated in my exclusion would understand how profoundly they had misjudged the situation. I didn't leave after Marcus sent me away from the entrance. Instead, I drove to a quiet section of the parking lot and waited. The ceremony would last an hour. The reception would follow. The moments that mattered would come later, when the formal events had concluded and the social performance shifted into its more unguarded phase. The call from Evelyn came 20 minutes after I parked. Her voice carried the same calm precision as always. "You're at the wedding," she said. It wasn't a question. I confirmed I was. "The firm received an inquiry today," she continued. "About you, from someone associated with the groom's business connections. They wanted to know if the sister who works in kitchens was really employed at a financial institution. They wanted to verify whether you had misrepresented yourself. I asked who made the inquiry. She gave me a name I didn't recognize immediately, but the association was clear. Someone from Marcus's professional network, probably someone who had heard about me over the years and wanted to confirm the family narrative before the wedding photographs were published." "The verification request backfired," Evelyn said. "The person who called us received more information than they expected. They now know about your role in the Whitfield transaction. They know about the client portfolio you manage. They know your current compensation." She paused. They seemed quite surprised. I could imagine. The Whitfield transaction had made the financial press 3 months ago. The client portfolio I managed included entities whose principals appeared in business publications regularly. My compensation was higher than Marcus's, though I had never calculated the comparison until that moment. Evelyn continued, "I've decided to come to the wedding. I wasn't planning to attend, but under the circumstances it seems appropriate. My attendance may clarify certain misunderstandings." I didn't ask her to explain further. Evelyn's decisions were not random. If she was coming to the wedding, she had reasons that extended beyond social courtesy. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat in the car processing what this might mean. An hour later, the ceremony ended. Guests began migrating toward the reception tent. I watched the procession from my parking space far enough to be invisible close enough to observe. The bride and groom emerged to applause. Photographs were taken. The video team captured every angle. Marcus looked triumphant, the master of ceremonies at his own success. The sound reached me before I understood what was happening. An engine, powerful and unmistakable, approaching the venue from the main road. Heads turned, conversations paused. A vehicle I recognized from Evelyn's firm pulled into the venue, a black car whose presence at industry events commanded attention without requiring explanation. The driver emerged first and opened the rear door. Evelyn stepped out with the unhurried grace of someone who had entered more important rooms than this one. She wore dark gray, understated but expensive. Her posture communicated what her clothing did not, that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. I got out of my car and walked toward the entrance. This time, no security stopped me. The guard who had blocked me earlier was occupied staring at the arrival, trying to assess its significance. I passed through without acknowledgement. Evelyn noticed me as I approached. Her expression didn't change, but she adjusted her trajectory slightly so that our paths converged near the entrance to the reception tent. Guests watched. Some recognized her. Word began spreading through clusters of people who understood what her presence at a wedding like this implied about someone's significance. Marcus appeared at the tent entrance, his expression sliding from triumph to confusion. He had been greeting guests with practiced enthusiasm, but Evelyn's arrival disrupted his rhythm. He approached her with the performative friendliness of someone who knows they're being observed but doesn't understand the context. "Welcome," he said. "I'm Marcus. I don't believe we've met." Evelyn regarded him with polite neutrality. "I'm here to see Natalie," she said, "your sister." The words landed in the space between us like physical objects. Marcus's face cycled through surprise, recalculation, and finally uncertainty. He looked at me, then back at Evelyn, trying to construct a framework that made sense. "Natalie," he repeated. "Your sister Evelyn confirmed. She manages significant relationships for our organization. I wanted to offer my personal congratulations on your wedding, given her connection to your family." The guests nearby had fallen silent. The videographer was still recording. The moment that Marcus had orchestrated to exclude me was now capturing something he hadn't anticipated: the introduction of his kitchen staff sister by a woman whose professional presence at any event constituted its own form of endorsement. Marcus recovered enough to smile, though the expression looked unstable. "That's wonderful," he managed. "We're so glad you could join us." Evelyn nodded. Then she turned to me. "We should talk later about the Morrison proposal. There are developments I'd like your analysis on before Monday." I acknowledged the request casually, as if receiving strategic assignments at family weddings was ordinary, which in the life I now lived, it essentially was. Marcus watched this exchange with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It took me a moment to identify it: disorientation. He was standing in his own wedding at his own reception, surrounded by his own guests, and he no longer understood the hierarchy of the room. Evelyn excused herself to greet other attendees, leaving me standing across from my brother, for the first time since he had sent me away from the entrance. Neither of us spoke immediately. The space between us held everything that had happened over the past decade: the labels, the exclusions, the assumptions that had just collapsed. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. "I didn't know," he said. "About your work." "I know you didn't," I replied. "You never asked." The reception continued, but its center had shifted. Where Marcus had been the focal point, now there was uncertainty. Guests who had watched the exchange with Evelyn whispered to each other, trying to piece together what they had witnessed. The sister who worked in kitchens, the woman who didn't belong in the video. She had arrived with someone whose presence contradicted everything the family had communicated about her. Evelyn moved through the reception with practiced ease, speaking to guests who recognized her from professional contexts, offering congratulations to the bride and groom with the gracious distance of someone attending out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. Every interaction added information to the puzzle the guests were assembling. Why was this woman here? What was her connection to the family? How had they failed to mention something this significant? My mother found me near the edge of the tent, where I had positioned myself to observe without attracting attention. Her face carried an expression I remembered from childhood. the careful management of visible emotion when circumstances demanded composure. She approached slowly as if uncertain whether I would welcome the conversation. "Natalie," she said, "I didn't realize you were involved with someone so prominent." I told her I worked with Evelyn, that the involvement was professional, not personal. My mother processed this information with visible difficulty. The framework she had used to understand me for decades didn't accommodate this new data. She had stored me in a category marked limited, unremarkable, best managed through low expectations. The appearance of a woman like Evelyn disrupted that categorization in ways she wasn't equipped to handle. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I asked her what she would have done with the information if I had. She didn't answer. The silence extended for several seconds while she searched for words that would defend the family's behavior without acknowledging its cruelty. Eventually, she settled on deflection. "We would have been proud," she said. "We're your family." I told her that family had felt very different from this side of the relationship. Before she could respond, my father appeared beside her. His expression was harder to read, more guarded. He had spent years cultivating neutrality, and even now, with the family narrative collapsing around him, he maintained his careful distance. "This is quite a surprise," he said. His tone suggested neither approval nor criticism, just observation. I agreed that it was. He looked toward Evelyn, who was now speaking with the bride's parents. "Your work must be very demanding," he said. "We rarely hear from you." I told him the demands were manageable. I told him my schedule allowed time for family contact if family contact was wanted. He absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected. "Well," he said, "we're glad you're doing well." It was the most acknowledgement I had received from him in years, and it was still inadequate. Not because I needed more, but because it revealed how little he had been willing to offer when the cost was lower. Now that the cost had become public embarrassment, he found words he couldn't find when I was struggling. The pattern was clarifying in its consistency. Marcus approached us with his bride, whose name was Jennifer, and whose expression suggested she had been briefed very differently about the family dynamics than what she was now witnessing. She smiled at me with the careful politeness of someone navigating unexpected information. "Your associate seems lovely," Jennifer said, gesturing toward Evelyn. "Very accomplished." I thanked her. I didn't correct the characterization of Evelyn as an associate. The nuance wasn't relevant to people who had only just learned I existed in a professional dimension. Marcus stood beside Jennifer with the forced composure of someone managing a reputation emergency. He had built his wedding around an image of success, and that image had just been complicated by the revelation that his invisible sister was not as invisible as he had presented her to be. "I should have known," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost private, despite the people around us. "About your work." I told him that knowing would have required asking. He didn't respond immediately. The accusation, delivered without malice but without softness, either settled into the space between us. He had constructed a narrative that served his self-image, and he had maintained that narrative by avoiding any information that might contradict it. The avoidance wasn't passive, it was active, and now its consequences were becoming visible to everyone at his wedding. Evelyn returned to our group, her timing impeccable. She addressed the family with the same composed directness she brought to every professional interaction. "Natalie has been exceptional in her work," she said. I wanted her family to know that directly, since professional achievements can sometimes get lost in family dynamics. My mother murmured something appreciative. My father nodded. Marcus managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jennifer looked like she wanted to ask questions, but knew this wasn't the appropriate venue. Evelyn continued. "The proposal she's leading will position our clients for significant growth over the next decade. Her analysis has been instrumental. I don't say this casually." The words hung in the air. Professional endorsement delivered publicly to an audience that had systematically dismissed my capabilities for years. The humiliation wasn't mine anymore. It had shifted to the people who had built their understanding of me on foundations that had just crumbled. I looked at my family, at the faces I had known my entire life, and I saw something I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. They didn't know who I was anymore. The labels they had assigned, the categories they had created, the assumptions they had protected, none of it fit the person standing in front of them. And for the first time in my memory, they had no framework for what came next. The wedding ended the way weddings do, with goodbyes and promises, and the gradual emptying of a venue that would be cleaned by people nobody remembered to thank. I stayed until the crowd thinned, not out of obligation, but out of a strange sense of completion. I had come to observe, to understand, to see clearly what I had felt dimly for years. The observation was finished now. The understanding was complete. My mother approached me one final time as the reception wound down. Her expression had softened from confusion to something that might have been regret, though I couldn't be certain. She had spent years not seeing me, and changing that pattern in a single evening was beyond her capability. "I wish we had known," she said, "about everything." I told her that knowledge required curiosity, and curiosity required attention, and attention was a choice she had made differently. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She just stood there looking at me as if seeing features she had never noticed before. Finally, she reached out and touched my arm, a gesture so unfamiliar that I almost flinched. "I'm sorry," she said. I told her I believed her. I didn't tell her that belief didn't change anything. Some things are understood without being spoken. My father found me next, standing near the exit where the hired cars were collecting guests too important to drive themselves. He cleared his throat the way he always did when approaching something uncomfortable. "I should have said more," he offered. Over the years, I agreed that he should have. He looked away toward the horizon, toward anywhere that wasn't my face. "Your mother and we didn't handle things well. With you and Marcus, the way things are divided." I told him that the division required participants, and that his participation had been silent. He nodded slowly, accepting the characterization without protest. "You're right," he said. "I should have been different." I told him he still could be. The future hadn't happened yet. He seemed to consider this turning the possibility over like an unfamiliar object. Then he looked at me with something that might have been respect, though the expression sat awkwardly on features accustomed to neutrality. "You've done well," he said. "Better than I understood." I thanked him. Not because the acknowledgement changed anything, but because accepting it cost me nothing and might mean something to him. Marcus approached last. He had changed from his wedding attire into something more casual, the costume of celebration replaced by the clothes of ordinary life. His expression was difficult to read, layers of pride and embarrassment and calculation shifting beneath the surface. "I underestimated you," he said. The words came slowly, as if each one required effort. For a long time, I told him underestimation was a family tradition. He almost smiled at that. "Fair enough," he said. Then after a pause, "I don't know how to fix this." I told him fixing might not be the right frame. Understanding might be better. Learning, changing patterns that had been comfortable for too long. He considered this. "Is that what you want?" Understanding. I told him I wanted to be seen accurately. Not more, not less. Just accurately. The rest would follow, or it wouldn't. He extended his hand. Not for a handshake, but palm up, an invitation rather than an assertion. I looked at it for a moment, at the hand of my brother, who had built his success partly by stepping on my diminishment, and I made a choice. I took his hand, briefly acknowledging the gesture, without pretending it resolved everything. Then I walked to my car. The drive back to Chicago took 4 hours in light traffic. I spent the first hour thinking about the wedding, about the faces of family members, recalibrating their understanding of someone they thought they knew. The second hour, I thought about Evelyn, about the work waiting for me, about the life I had built in the years nobody had watched. The third hour, I thought about nothing in particular, letting my mind rest in the space between past and future. The fourth hour, I thought about what I wanted next. The answer came without drama. I wanted to continue. I wanted to keep building, keep learning, keep becoming whatever I was capable of becoming. The family would adapt or they wouldn't. Marcus would change or he wouldn't. My parents would see me differently, or they would remain locked in their old frameworks. None of that was mine to control. What I controlled was my own trajectory, my own standards, my own definition of success. They had called me the kitchen staff sister, and I had let that label stand while I built something they couldn't see. Now something was visible. Now the label was obsolete. But the lesson wasn't about proving them wrong. The lesson was about not needing their approval to move forward. I pulled into my parking spot in Chicago as the sun was setting. The city looked the same as it always did, indifferent to personal dramas focused on its own endless business. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, changed out of my navy dress, and sat by the window with a cup of tea that cooled while I watched the lights come on across the skyline. My phone contained messages I hadn't checked. Work correspondence, a note from Evelyn about Monday's schedule, a text from Marcus that simply said thank you for coming, which I would respond to later or not. The story had reached its turning point, but turning points are not endings. Life continues past the moments of revelation. Families adapt slowly or not at all. Professional success brings its own challenges different from the challenges of obscurity, but no less real. The woman I had become would face problems the woman I had been couldn't have imagined, but I would face them whole. That was the difference. I had walked away from the wedding not victorious, because victory implied someone had to lose, and I wasn't interested in anyone's loss. I had walked away complete, integrated, no longer split between who I was and who they thought I should be. If you've ever been labeled by people who didn't bother to know you if you've built something in silence, while others assumed you were standing still, if you've waited for a truth to become undeniable before revealing it, then this story might feel familiar. The details change. The core remains. We become ourselves not when others finally see us, but when we stop needing them to look. Thank you for listening. If this resonated with something in your own experience, I'd be honored if you shared it or left a comment about a moment when someone underestimated you. And if you want to hear more stories about dignity, justice, and the long road to becoming who you were meant to be, consider subscribing. I'll be here telling the next story whenever you're ready.